Thanks ever so much. And yeah, it's lovely to be here with you this evening. I'm just going to stick my slides up so that we are ready to go. Brilliant. So yeah, it's lovely to be here with you this evening. Very much the aim of what I'm going to talk to you this evening is all things carbon. So we're going to think about just understanding why carbon is important for us on the farm, why we should be thinking about it in terms of managing carbon on the farm, what might be some of the drivers for us to think about that. But then more importantly, think about, well, actually, what are the benefits to me on my farm in terms of thinking about carbon? How does that link to where I'm trying to take my farm anyway, in terms of improved productivity, improved performance, improved resource use efficiency, and really start to sort of bust some of those myths that are out there around carbon. So, as I say, my name's Becky. I work for an organisation called the Farm Carbon Toolkit. Some of you might have come across us before. For those of you that haven't, we're a farmer-led organisation that was set up back in 2009 to really try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers around all the fun stuff. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving business resilience with a particular focus on soil health. And I suppose where we differ from some other organisations in this space is that, as I say, we were set up by farmers for farmers. Our real sort of ethos is that we think that farmers talking to farmers is the best way to sort of make some of these changes happen. We're a not for profit. And as I say, the tools that we have in terms of our calculator and our toolkit are freely available for farmers to use to help you understand how this sort of stuff can really benefit your business and give you some more information and become more informed. In terms of me, so I've been involved with the organisation for 11 years. So very much sort of providing that outward, onward help and support for farmers. So I lead our team of advisors who are all working out on farm to deliver a variety of different projects focusing on measuring carbon footprints, measuring soil health, helping farmers understand what are the things that they can do to change. I've been in sort of this space around carbon and resource management for about the last 15 years. And previously to that was we're doing a little bit in applied research. And then before that, very much was out on farm. But also, confession time from me. I am a complete and utter carbon sado. This is my favorite topic. I like nothing more than talking about this topic for hours and hours and hours on end. So, as Dewi said at the beginning, please do as we go through, stick your questions into the Q&A because, you guys have given up your evening to listen to what I've got to say, but really, this is an opportunity to then have a discussion and for me to answer some of your questions if I can. As well as obviously working at Farm Carbon Toolkit, I also spent 2 years back in 2016 substantially increasing my own carbon footprint, flying around the world doing a Nuffield scholarship, very much on this topic. And I suppose the reason why I did my Nuffield scholarship back in 2016 was because we would put on events a little bit like this one, although back in 2016 we didn't do a huge number of webinars, but we'd put them on in person and, we'd turn up and we'd get ready and nobody would really turn up in terms of farms, or maybe one or two farms would come. But it really wasn't seen as a sort of business priority back then. The farmers that came would often have a really good time and say, wow, this is really interesting. But, there just wasn't that drive in terms of actually understanding this sort of thing. Now, if we fast forward to where we are now, absolutely that's changed in terms of, now we're having a huge amount of drivers in terms of why we might want to manage carbon on the farm. If we think about financial incentives, if we think about policy incentives, if we think about pressures that are coming down supply chains or all of those other sorts of things, suddenly, as well as consumer interest, suddenly the spotlight is on agriculture in terms of its environmental impact. So those are some of the things that we'll think about as we go through. But just to give you a little bit more background in terms of what we do at Farm Carbon Toolkit, purely and simply, we work with farmers. And I suppose the work that we do with farmers comes under three key areas, really. Firstly, we work with farmers to measure. Okay. And measurement is a key part of what we do in terms of whether we are measuring carbon footprints, and we'll talk a little bit about how carbon footprints work as we go through, whether we're measuring stuff that's going on below our feet. I'm often to be found down a hole. It's one of my favourite places to be. And we have quite a lot of work going on in terms of things like our soil carbon project, where we look at how we measure and monitor soil carbon. But measurement is a really important part. Measurement gives us data. Data is really important, but we don't get it's not the end all in terms of our data. So data is important and doing that measurement. But actually, in terms of making that impact, we also work with farmers to help them understand what does that data actually mean? can they use that information to be able to make those changes that they can do around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving soil health, improving business resilience, all of those sorts of things. So a lot of the time you'll find us standing in a field with a group of farmers thinking about a variety of different things which will overall impact in terms of either reducing emissions or improving sequestration. So, a lot of the projects that we're delivering are focusing on what are those practical solutions? What are those things? What do I need to do with my stock? What do I need to do in terms of my manure management? How can I manage my grazing that best both reduces emissions and improves sequestration? What are the options that I can do? And actually, how practically can I implement them on the ground? But also, more importantly, we work with farmers to help communicate and challenge. Okay, because we know, as I've just said, the environmental impact of agriculture has never more been under the spotlight in terms of what we are doing, both around generating greenhouse gas emissions, but also what we can potentially do in terms of delivering some of those solutions. And often, if we think about the messaging and the communications that go out there, we are the problem as an industry. We're the ones where we have to do lots of different things. Whereas in reality, we have a lot of farmers that we work with who are doing brilliant things. And actually, one of our roles is to really try and talk about the good things that are happening, to really try and start to redress that balance and start to talk about that narrative around the good things that are happening on farm. And that might be good things that are happening around reducing emissions. It might be good things that are happening in terms of improving sequestration, all of those other sorts of things to really start to showcase what's happening and challenge some of those narratives that are out there. Because really there's a lot of nuance there that we really need to think about. So in terms of the key things that we do, our main resources of the organisation are we have a carbon calculator. That carbon calculator is freely available for farmers and growers to use, and that allows you to quantify what's going on in terms of where you're producing emissions and on the other side, where you're currently sequestering carbon, and look at what that balance looks like. You can start to use that as a way to think about your proximity towards net zero, or you can use that as a starting point to be able to comply with reporting requirements, or all of those are the sorts of things that you might want to use it for, scenario plan where you might want to go to. And then we have our toolkit. And our toolkit basically allows you to take what you've got from the carbon calculator and say, well, so what? Is it good? Is there areas where am I doing things really well? Where might I want to focus attentions in terms of making those changes as I go forward? And it breaks that all down into sort of practical information that you can go out and implement on farm tomorrow. As I say, we also spend quite a lot of time doing applied research in terms of things like our soil carbon project. We've got various different projects going on at the moment. We've just finished one looking at the use of sward, different diverse mixes within swards in terms of what that's doing with, helping with worm burdens within lambs, for example. Lots of different things where we take questions that we want to know the answers to, and we do that out with a range of farmers who are running commercial farm businesses. We spend a lot of time, as I say, doing soil sampling and carbon testing through our soil carbon project, really starting to understand how we measure soil carbon, how we manage it, and what are some of those practices that can make the difference. As I say, creating networks and sharing knowledge is really, really important. Actually helping each other, understanding, having those discussions. So a bit like this session we're having this evening, all of those sorts of things to really try and see what are the practical things that we can do and what impact will they have on different farms. We also run the Soil Farmer of the Year competition. And for anyone that hasn't come across the Soil Farmer of the Year competition, it's a competition really aimed at championing and promoting those farmers who are doing absolutely fantastic things around sustainable soils management. Now, that competition opens each year on World Soils Day. And for any of you that haven't already got World Soils Day ringed in your calendar as a day where very exciting things happen, it is the 5th of December. And so that competition is open at the moment. So if we've got anybody who is, and I'm sure we've got lots of you who are doing fantastic things around soil management, please get an application in. That competition, the application window is open until the 5th of March, and then we go through a judging process, and then we reward the finalists at Groundswell. And then we have a range of other sort of strategic projects. So we have a farm net zero project in Cornwall looking at showcasing the positive value that farmers can have to contributing to net zero. So we've got 3 demos to get them to net zero by 2025, by the end of this year, and they're all well on the way to doing that. And then we've got a network of 40 monitor farms which are aiming to reduce their emissions by 30% and also their cost of production by 10% along the way. We work with a variety of different landlords, again, supporting their tenants in terms of looking at what they can do. We've just been doing a lot of work recently on measuring upland carbon, so understanding what's going on beneath commons, fells, all those sorts of things, and understanding the role that that grazing animal has within that maintenance. And then, as I say, a lot of work around how we communicate this topic to farmers. How do we align this with where we're trying to go? Okay, so that's a bit of a background in terms of to us. Let's now jump into thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, carbon, and my farm. Okay. And although a lot of the language around this sort of topic very much is around carbon, we think about net zero carbon, we think about carbon footprinting, all of those sorts of things. Actually, when we think about emissions that are coming from agriculture, portion of those emissions are actually coming from carbon dioxide. The vast majority of those emissions are coming from two other gases, okay? They're coming from methane and they're coming from nitrous oxide, okay? And the combination of those three gases together makes up agriculture's contribution to UK PLC's footprint. And at the moment, agriculture is responsible for about 12% of our emissions within the UK, okay? If we think about actually that carbon dioxide and what we're responsible, agriculture is responsible for about 2% of carbon dioxide emissions. But when you add those other two gases together, agriculture is responsible for about 12%. Now, what into a room of non-farmers, I won't put that graph up. What I'll do is I'll say, guess the proportion of emissions that are coming from agriculture, and you'll get people that will say, or 80%, 70%. I say, no, 12. Okay. And what's really important to remember is that for that 12%, we're also producing your food. And we're also doing that wide range of other things that's happening within our farms and how we're managing those farms. But even if you're not interested in any of this sort of stuff from an environmental perspective, there is a business benefit to thinking about carbon on your farm because there's a really good relationship between efficient use of resources and a reduction in your carbon footprint. So as I say, if you do this for no other reason, you will save money. But there isn't one magic management practice that all of us can go away and do and is going to have exactly the same impact on all of our farms. Each of our farms is a unique combination of what's above the ground, what's under the soil, what falls out the sky, and what we do in the middle. So it's about thinking about using carbon as another sort of assessment metric to look at what's happening on your farm and then use the outcomes to sort of thinking about, well, where might I want to focus my attentions moving forward? As I've said already, we're not just producing these emissions for the sake of them, we're producing them because we're producing food. And that's a really important point to remember when we're thinking about that wider communication piece. It's difficult to measure because we're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with three gases, and there might be some things that we may focus on that might reduce one gas but lead to an increase in other gases. And it's dependent on the weather. Okay, so we are dealing with biological systems that are inherently linked to our carbon and nitrogen cycles. Okay, so we are never going to totally eliminate greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture because these carbon and nitrogen cycles are going to keep going. But before we all get too depressed and think, oh my goodness, why am I giving up my evening? We are also the only industry that can deliver those solutions. So this is why it can be slightly complicated when we're thinking about communicating this sort of stuff, because unlike other sectors, we're not just dealing with one gas, we're dealing with three in terms of the fact that we're generating these emissions, but we're also potentially one of those solutions. So where do these gases actually come from then? So let's have a think about those three different gases. So nitrous oxide, a gas that nobody really spends a huge amount of time thinking about. But nitrous oxide is a really important greenhouse gas. And it's an important greenhouse gas for two main reasons. Number one, as a gas, it's much more potent in terms of its ability to cause global temperature rise. It's about 270 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And about 70% of nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture. Okay, so we can have all sorts of really legitimate conversations about what's going on with methane, but nitrous oxide, we have to own that one. Where does it come from? It comes from how we manage our soils, our fertilizers, and our manures. So again, our soils and what we're putting on in terms of inputs of nitrogen, all of that very much is wrapped up with what's happening around nitrous oxide emissions. Methane, our much maligned ruminant animals. 98% of the methane that comes out of a cow or a sheep comes out the front end, not the back end, as we're often led to believe. And there's a loss of potential energy that that animal could be using to grow. Okay. So again, there's a sort of efficiency piece there. What's often forgotten about methane is it's not just produced from those animals in terms of that enteric fermentation, that process by which those animals are turning something that we can't eat into something that we can. It's also produced from how we manage, store, and apply our manures and slurries. So again, our non-ruminants, in terms of our pig and poultry systems, are also producing methane in terms of what they're doing around their manure management. Then we've got carbon dioxide, which again is the gas that most other industries are very much focusing on, predominantly coming from the burning of fossil fuels. So it's the use of diesel, electricity. Potentially, we've got opportunities to generate renewable energy if that's appropriate for us. And then we've got everything that's going on below our feet in terms of our soils, which are a really large store of carbon, what we do in terms of the level of cultivation, grazing management, all of those sorts of things. We have the opportunity to put more carbon within those soils, as well as our other above ground biomasses in terms of our hedges, our trees, our environmental areas, all of those sorts of things. So this can be really useful because it's then when we're thinking about practically what do we actually need to do, we can start to think about those levers which are going to make a difference. If we think about why bother managing carbon on the farm, well, if we think about it from a bigger picture perspective, we know that there is obviously a lot of interest. And you can sort of see from that diagram on the right hand side there, suddenly it's not just that interest that's coming from government in terms of policy targets around net zero. We know that as the UK, we need to be at net zero by 2050, and that's obviously mandated in terms of, under the Climate Change Act and all of that sort of stuff. We also know that we've got pressure and interest that's looking from our supply chains. We also know that there's a lot of interest that's coming from other industries that we deal with. So suddenly we're starting to look for stuff with our landlords, also potentially thinking about banks, lenders, insurance companies, all of these sorts of things that are looking in terms of agriculture's ability to decarbonize in terms of reduce emissions, but at the same time also potentially look at some of these options. If we look more widely than the UK, we've also got international targets in terms of the Paris Climate Accord and us all working together globally to limit our impact on temperature rise. Also, what happens in terms of suddenly, as we have a range of different people that are looking inwards as to us to deliver some of these solutions, we have the development in terms of potential income generation as the carbon markets start to evolve. And all of this means is that suddenly, what was quite a simple conversation and quite a simple interaction, suddenly we are combined in lots of different sort of conversations around how we can potentially help. What we also need to remember with all of this is that although climate change is incredibly important, we need to make sure that we don't get carbon tunnel vision. Okay. Carbon is one aspect of sustainability on the farm. There is a huge amount of other things that we deliver on the farm in terms of some of those, natural capitals, clean air, biodiversity, water, all of those sorts of things. And when we're having these discussions, we need to make sure that we don't become very carbon tunnel visioned and we think about the sort of wider holistic impact in terms of some of the things that we're thinking about. But if we zoom back down and thinking about why is managing carbon important for me on my farm? Well, as I said already, by understanding what's happening in terms of our carbon footprint, it allows us to be more informed and make decisions. So when we're thinking about what we might want to do with our farm as we go forward in the short, medium, and long term, as well as evaluating the economic benefit and the economic cost of doing what we might want to do, and the practical considerations, we can also start to think of it from a carbon perspective now as well. As I've said already, it enables a positive narrative. And at the moment, a lot of the narrative is being had for us, potentially by people that are trying to sort of go one way. But by us understanding what's happening with carbon on our farms, we can actually start to change that narrative around what's happening. And that's not saying that we have to suddenly become the mouthpiece for the whole industry, but you can start to have a more informed conversation about what's happening on your farm and talk about some of those positive things. It also allows us to be more future-proofed. So again, by thinking about managing carbon on your farm now, you put yourself on that front foot when people are starting to come calling. As I've said already, managing carbon on the farm has economic benefits because the things that are coming onto your farm with a high economic cost also tend to have a high carbon footprint. So whether we're thinking about fuel, whether we're thinking about feed, whether we're thinking about fertilizer, all of those sorts of things, not only, as I say, are representing a cost to our business, but at the same time, potentially are also going to be volatile in terms of their costs. So the more we can shore ourselves up against that price volatility, the more it makes absolute sense for us from a business perspective, as well as thinking about it from a carbon perspective. Also has resilience benefits. And what's really important to remember is that as an industry, as well as the fact that we can move that, we can reduce emissions, we can improve sequestration, as farmers, we are one of those industries that is most at risk from those changing weather patterns. So, in terms of the direct impact on our business from extreme wet, extreme dry, extreme heat, extreme cold, all of those sorts of things have a direct impact in terms of how we manage our business today, let alone in 10 years' time. So, we have to, the more that we can do to build resilience into the system by thinking about how we can manage our soils so that they act like a sponge, so they can hold on to water, they can release it when we don't need to. The more that we can build that resilience into our grassland system so that actually we can continue to produce forage under those conditions where potentially it's slightly more challenging, the better for our business, as well as thinking about those wider resilience benefits to our farm and the industry. And as I've said already, managing carbon on the farm allows us to be more future-proof. So some of you might already be being asked information in terms of to provide your carbon footprint. If you're not already being asked for that carbon footprint information, it absolutely will come in the next sort of, 12 to 18 months. So by thinking about this information now, you put yourself on the front foot in terms of as people come calling and as people start to ask you for that information, you are already informed in terms of what that's going to look like. And you can then start to sort of think about what might be some of those levers that you can pull to make a change as we go forward. And that whole process of managing carbon on the farm starts by being able to measure it. And I know that for a lot of you, the idea of doing your carbon footprint is not something that fills you with joy. All right. I am that sad person. I love it. I literally wake up in the morning and go, yes, today I can do some carbon footprints. I'm not that naive to think that you will all do that. But actually, carbon footprinting is incredibly important in terms of giving you that baseline. Okay. And again, it just is a way of being able to provide that mechanism to measure what's happening. There's different options that are available. So as I said earlier, we have a calculator. I don't mind which calculator you use. Just make sure that you're using it consistently with you go through. But all of those sorts of things. But having that data and having that baseline is absolutely that first step in terms of being able to quantify the contribution that farm is making to climate change. Okay. And there's lots and lots of discussions about carbon footprints and about the fact that calculators are horrendously complicated and they're going to take you from now until Christmas to fill it out and, all of those sorts of things. At the simplest level, all a carbon calculator is doing is it's identifying the amount and the source of those three different greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are emitted from the farm, and then highlights areas where you might be able to make improvements or changes to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. They should also, in terms of your carbon calculator that you choose, they should also highlight where you're currently sequestering carbon. And again, allow you to evaluate future projects. As I've said already, they allow you to become more aware and make more informed decisions. But the metrics that you use, in terms of whichever calculator you choose, need to be relevant. So it needs to make sense to your business. It needs to be able to evaluate the impact of how you're managing your business. It needs to be consistent. And some consistency is something that we have had a bit of an issue with in carbon calculating in the past. Although having said that, if you ever read any of those articles which say, we have 755 different carbon calculators, it's not strictly true. There are basically 4 that are available industry-wide. And there is some slight differences between them. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. But also, whichever calculator you use, the process of doing the calculation is not the bit that brings you joy, okay? Even for me, the process of doing the calculation is the bit that you need to get to the exciting bit, which is what does that calculation tell me and what can I do with it? So again, the process of doing it needs to not be so hideous that you have to go and lie down in a darkened room for 3 weeks. It actually is that first bit to allow you to say, well, so what? What can I do with this information and what can I change moving forward? And as I say, number one bugbear with carbon calculators, they all vary. They're all going to tell me different results. So actually, I'm not going to bother. Well, if we think about it for a minute, why do they vary? Well, the main reason why calculators vary is what they're actually footprinting. Okay, so there are two main different types of ways that things can be footprinted within agriculture. You can footprint in terms of a product level footprint. So again, that's basically looking at, your land production, whatever it is, just that product. So you're just looking at that one enterprise in terms of a product. Or you can look at everything that's happening on the farm, which is a starting point, which then you can allocate to different products. And there are two different standards depending on which one of those you're going to do. But what's often been sort of used within supply chains, down retailers, and all of those sorts of things has often been that enterprise level footprint. And the problem that we have if you just start at an enterprise level footprint is that the current standards that exist are only focusing on your emissions intensity per kilo of output. Okay. And what that tells you is that, again, that's not including the sequestration. So it's just a method of quantifying emissions. So one of the big reasons why some of these calculators vary is some include sequestration, the good stuff, and some don't. Okay. One of the other reasons why some of them vary is how much of that sort of scope 3 they include. So again, if you think about how we put data into footprints, you have direct emissions, you have indirect emissions, and then you have embedded emissions. Depending on how much of that embedded emission is included, that can be where some of the differences are. Calculators can vary depending on whether they've been built or developed by the supply chain to answer a specific question, or whether they've been driven by farmers. They can use slightly different data sources. And there is, as I say, if that all makes you want to think, oh my goodness, sort yourselves out, there is some work going on currently in terms of harmonization. So the calculators, or three of the calculators, have come together to really try and provide some harmonization in terms of the approach. But alongside that, what we also need is the harmonization of standards, because at the moment there are a variety of different standards that calculators can align to. So almost like calculators can harmonize in terms of their methodologies, but we still need that level of harmonization going on within the method, within the standards. But also for you, in terms of how much data do you need to put in as a farmer? Some of these calculators have been built as sort of quite light touch calculators, which will just give you an answer quite quickly. Now, if you have one of those sorts of calculators, they're great. You don't need to spend very much time on them, but they're not going to give you that level of detail in terms of the evaluate the impacts of your management, as opposed to if you're not having to put that data in to start off with. But whichever calculator you use, the important bit is actually looking at the data and saying, so what? Okay. Quite often what happens is we'll go through this process with a farmer and we'll get to this point and we'll say, so your footprint is 600 tons. And you're met with a bit of a blank look, which says, well, is that good? Is that bad? It's not a language that we're particularly familiar with. So understanding the results of your footprint, interpreting them, and using them as a starting point to be able to evaluate what you're going to do with your farm moving forward is really important. It gives you a baseline. It puts that stake in the ground and says, right, well, this is where we are now. And these might be some of the things that we can think about doing as we move forward. As I said already, it allows you to become more informed, but also when you put your data into the carbon calculator, the first time you do it, obviously it takes a little bit of time because you're putting your data in, but that is then the start of the fun. Because once your data's there, you can then create as many different versions of your calculator as you like. And you can say, well, okay, what would be the impact if I moved to more rotational grazing? What would be the impact if I changed what I was feeding my animals? What would be the impact if I changed how I was managing my manure? And once you've got that baseline footprint there, you can scenario plan and you can look at a range of different opportunities and evaluate the impact of what they're having on your carbon footprint. And that can be really useful when you're wanting to think potentially about, investments to the farm. You can calculate the carbon benefits of doing these things alongside the financials. Okay, so that's great. We can measure it. What can we actually do about reducing it? And if we think about, what are those key areas in terms of reducing emissions, we're sort of really thinking about sort of 5 main areas. So management of our livestock, thinking about energy efficiency, thinking about nutrient management, grassland management, and soil management. All of those sorts of things. And again, there's lots of different things within there that we can think about. If we think about improved livestock performance, again, predominantly this is focusing on reducing those methane emissions in terms of enteric, but also then thinking about nitrous oxide emissions that are to do with our manure. And all of these sort of strategies that we're thinking about around improved livestock performance, very much around improving efficiency. Okay, so things that you're going to be doing anyway in terms of trying to run a profitable and productive system. Okay, so being on top of your health parameters, making sure that actually your animals are doing what you need them to do, focusing on that fertility management and reproductive efficiency. So making sure that actually you've got a really efficient system going through there. You've got what you need to in terms of parity, in terms of performance, management of those young stock in terms of making sure that they're actually getting to that point where they're weaned and they can go on. Feed. Feed represents a big cost to the farm. There's lots of things that we can think about around the embedded carbon cost in the feed before it comes onto the farm, as well as then thinking about how efficiently you are using that feed. How does it match your requirements in terms of nutritional requirements? All of those sorts of things. Okay, so there's lots and lots of things that we can do around building that efficiency, as well as thinking about, as I say, health planning, culling policy, all of those sorts of things. Now, I suppose the sort of often the recommendations or the requirements in terms of reducing emissions intensity is to get these animals gone quicker. And a lot of that discussion absolutely is to do with the fact that if we're focusing on methane, obviously these animals are alive for less time. But there's a real balance to be had there about making sure that, where is that improved or that quicker finishing coming from, and where is that feed coming from? Because again, if we're bringing more feed onto the farm in terms of being able to get that finishing quicker, then actually that's representing a lot more cost to the business. So again, with all of these sorts of things, there's absolutely some nuance needed in terms of what's happening. If we're able to, finish lambs quicker because we've improved our grassland management, absolutely brilliant. Okay, if we're able to finish them because we're actually bringing on a lot more feed to be able to get that done, then we need to think about that because again, that's representing a cost to our business. Energy efficiency, again, tends to be something that we probably don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about. What we tend to find in terms of the work that we do is that we can reduce energy use by 10% on most farms with minimal impact, with no impact in terms of this is not by, actually investing in lots of kit. This is just by looking at how we're doing stuff. Obviously expensive things like renewable energy, but just looking at where are you currently using fuel? Where are you currently using energy? As I say, it's not something that's massively exciting, but there is a huge amount that can be done, especially in terms of it will also reduce costs. Nutrient management, absolute win, 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 win. Okay. Really thinking about specifically nitrogen. Nitrogen we know is incredibly energy intensive in terms of its production, but also in terms of how efficiently we're using it. We know it's a little bit of a leaky pipe, so we're never going to effectively utilize all of that nitrogen, but really trying to use as much as possible is really important. So, have we got legumes in our system? Can we actually start to utilize more legumes in terms of the fact that our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen? We have a species of plant that can actually fix nitrogen and mean that we don't have to put it on out of a bag. So it makes absolute economic sense as well as environmental sense. Applying fertilizer, are we really optimizing the use of that, both in terms of, the right amount, right time, down to things like fertilizer spreader to make sure that we're spreading it accurately. Looking at what's going on within our soil. So again, making sure our soils are at the right pH. Lime is our cheapest fertilizer. If our pH isn't right, then in terms of what we're putting on out in terms of our nutrients and fertilizer, not all of that is going to be used. So really making sure that our soil has enough air with it, making sure that our soil is not compacted, and then also thinking about that addition of organic matter. So feeding more organic matter into the system. Thinking about manure management. So again, how are we able to that really important resource that we've got, as I say, and avoiding losses of nitrogen through the system. Grassland management. So again, similarly to thinking about nutrient management, have we got soils that are providing that baseline position to optimize grass growth, both in terms of grass quality, but also in terms of grass yield? In terms of the current lays that we've got on the farm, Are they doing what we want them to do? Have we got the right mix in terms of those desirable species that we got there? Have we got species that we potentially don't want to be there? Can we use those as indicators to sort of look at how our system is performing? As I say, trying to incorporate legumes in where possible, thinking about how we're utilizing those really important tools in terms of our sheep to actually maximize those opportunities from grassland. We know that, as I say, that grazing practice is so important in terms of that carbon cycle, making sure we've also got those periods of rest to allow those roots to do what they need to do in terms of regenerate and disappear further down. And also then think about the species that we have. So again, it doesn't need to be that we need to go into an all singing, all dancing 56 different species mix, but how can we put species in there or encourage those species that might already be there that are going to build resilience into our system? And just as I say, a little bit of data here in terms of showing the importance of management. It's not just about, the fact that we've got stock grazing. That's really important. How are those stock grazing? So this is a little bit of work that we've been doing sort of through our soil carbon project, looking at sequestration benefits of paddock grazing. And again, by paddock grazing here, I don't mean that you're grazing animals in covers above their head and you're moving them every 5 minutes. This is literally grazing, shutting the gate, making sure we've got those periods of rest. And what we can see here is actually the impacts of on our soil organic matter percentage. So SOM, obviously soil organic matter percentage, at three different depths down our soil, we've got 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 30 centimetres, and 30 to 50 centimetres. And just the difference between a set stocked and a paddock grazing system, what that's doing in terms of improved carbon stock. And we can see that that's sequestering, almost another 37 tonnes of carbon per hectare from doing that. So again, if we think about some of the negativity that we often hear around livestock, this is the positive bit, which once we've got the data, we can start to feed in. Alongside the fact that by doing that sort of grazing, we're also going to reduce our emissions from improved grass utilization. Soil, as I say, we just started thinking about soil from a sequestration perspective, but in terms of reducing emissions, it's all about the structure. So your spade is your best friend. Go out, look at your soil, get to know your soil more intimately because it's the most asset that you have on the farm. If we've got soils that are wet and compacted, they are much more likely to emit nitrous oxide. So thinking about timeliness of operations, thinking about going and assessing the structure before you start doing any sort of intervention so that you can minimize disturbance. Thinking about, as I say, feeding more carbon into the system and really trying to get on top of compaction. I know it can be challenging when we have the weather conditions that we've had, but the more we can do to try and keep that air in the soil, the better. And then about storing more carbon. So again, that's what we can do about reducing emissions, but just flipping it on its other side and thinking about, well, okay, what can we also do about that unique asset that we have in terms of our ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it on our farms? And we know that soil is incredibly important in terms of the fact that our soils are one of the largest stores of carbon on the planet. Okay. So if we lose soil carbon, it's a really big deal. And it's not just a big deal from a carbon perspective, it's a big deal because it's also losing our most important resource in terms of our topsoil and therefore going to have those knock-on implications in terms of productivity. If we can improve our soil carbon levels, we can improve the quality of our soil and we can improve that yield stability, especially when we've got those periods of changing weather patterns. Really, really important to think about that. And a starting point, as I say, get your spade out, go and look at your fields. Potentially think about doing some baseline analysis so that you can understand where your levels are and what you might be able to do about it. But also remembering that our soils are all those other areas that you have on the farm, your trees, your hedgerows, those little boggy bits that potentially are a pain in the neck in terms of management. All of those are also storing carbon. So when you're doing that sort of assessment of where what's going on around your footprint, making sure that all of those areas are included. So what I thought I'd do just to finish off is just show you a couple of examples of things that we are doing to hopefully put it a little bit more in context. So again, this is a farm about just over 100 hectares. They've got about 650 ewes. And this is what their baseline position looks like in terms of their carbon footprint. And what you can see here is you can see on that top bit there, their carbon balance. Their carbon balance basically is their emissions, which you can see here is about 311 tonnes, taking away their sequestration or their offsets, which leaves them with their carbon balance. Okay, so we can see that this farm at the moment is emitting about 270 tonnes. We can then break that down in terms of the carbon balance per hectare. of just over about 2.5. But actually, again, we're producing these emissions because we're producing an output. So then we can also break that down in terms of per tonne, and we can see a carbon balance per tonne of about 0.65. That's a really important starting point. But what we then want to do is we want to poke it a little bit more and look at a bit detail and want to say, well, where are those emissions coming from? And where are those offsets coming from? So you can see that table at the bottom there looking at the proportion of emissions that are coming from different categories. So about 74% of the emissions to start off with were coming from the livestock, about 13.5% from ferts and stuff, and about 6% from fuel. On the other side, they've got some from coming from hedgerows. Hedgerows, really important store of carbon, a little bit of woodland. So a little bit of work thinking about what could they do, what could they change. We then go back next year and we can see that now we're at a point where those emissions have come down. They've improved their sequestration because what they've done is they've put a field into trial some herbal lays. And they've also looked at different grazing practices. So that's meant that they've been able to cut their inputs in terms of their fertilizer, which has represented a cost saving for their business. And at the same time, they're still maintaining what they need to do in terms of output. And what we can see here is that we are able to put in that herbal lay on the side in terms of thinking about the sequestration. So as a starting point, while we build up a picture in terms of soil testing, we can put a modelled value in there in terms of what that's providing in terms of sequestration. As I said, what we're also doing, and one of the other things that we really need to be careful of, is thinking about actually the value of these animals in terms of grazing. So this again is another case study farm which we're looking at, bigger farm with about 1,000 ewes. That's there. This is their starting point. But one of the things that we've been looking at on this farm is actually focusing on the value of that grazing. So what we've done here is we've done some longhand examples to show, because this farm has been working really hard on maintaining their dung beetle populations, is that actually those dung beetles, and because they've got really good levels of dung beetle activity happening on the farm, those dung beetles are doing an incredible job in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from each individual dung pat by 7% and emissions from the grassland system by 12%, because that then means that we are reducing those emissions associated with that manure management. What we've also seen is that actually, if you've got diverse groups of dung beetles on your farm, that can actually lead to a much higher greenhouse gas reduction. So all of these things are continuing to innovate and improve, which can then be fed back into the calculator to demonstrate some of the benefits that come from grazing systems. What we also know is that where we've got high levels of dung beetles, that soil nutrient content is higher because that nutrient is being taken down through the dung. Soil density decreases, so the soils have got more air, so they're less likely to produce nitrous oxide, and plant health improves. So it really is a win-win-win. So just to sort of try and bring that together, and as I say, I apologize, I know I've galloped through quite a lot there, but hopefully it's given you a little bit of an overview. Our businesses in terms of as farms, we are at the forefront of the impact of climate change. So we need to make sure that, we understand what's going to happen in terms of the impact that changing weather patterns are going to have on our business. But we are also a sector that delivers solutions. Okay, so it can seem like this is all a little bit overwhelming and too much, but the starting point for us, understand where your emissions are coming from. Okay, and what you can do about it to future-proof your business. Okay, so this is a really good time, if you're not already being asked for this information, get your head around it a little bit. If you want to have a go with a carbon calculator, do. If you don't, just think about where are your emissions coming from. Getting to grips with carbon, there is a huge amount of terminology, metrics, acronyms, all of these sorts of things which can seem a little bit foreign, but just starting to think about what it means will help you to understand what the scope is on your farm. And it's really important that, as well as being able to quantify what's happening from an emissions perspective, we're also able to get to know our soils more intimately, okay? Because they are our most important asset. And if we think about the ability for our farms to provide those solutions, a lot of those start with what's happening within our soil. And so in order to do that, we need to think about baselining, because if we can baseline not just our carbon footprint, but we can also start to get an understanding of what's happening within our soils, it gives us that starting point or that stake in the ground. It also allows us to talk about the positive things that we're doing and allows us to identify the options for the future. So thank you ever so much for listening. As I say, I'm more than happy to answer any questions as we go along, but also my email address is on there. So if anybody wants to send me any questions afterwards or thinks about things later, please do. As I say, I'm more than happy to have those conversations.
Becky, thank you ever so much. I think you've converted us to be carbon saddles as well now. You have me anyway. Absolutely. You've made something that is actually it is off-putting in the initial sort of concept into something that's very proactive and involving. So yeah, it's great, really. Okay, we've got a few questions that have come through. Some of them we'll just deal with those first because I've also had a couple other through email. But there is a question there in terms of how does a flying flock actually cope in terms of its impact in terms of carbon? Flying flock, and the fact that it's a flock that's been bought every year. Yeah, normally a crop of lambs taken from them, then exited. So
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's a really interesting one in terms of we there isn't, I suppose, there isn't a sort of standard approach for doing those sorts of things. So sometimes if you've got a flying flock, similar to if you've got a flying herd, it can seem, if you are comparing yourself to other flocks, it can seem like your footprint is lower because you haven't got all those embedded emissions associated in terms of bringing that next generation or all those sorts of things. So at the moment, what I would say is that if you were comparing that to, another sheep system where, for example, they were doing all of that young stock management as well, you're obviously going, because you haven't got those embedded emissions. Arguably, the question is, well, who are you comparing for and why? So the best person to sort of benchmark with and to show change over time is your own business. So if you are a flying flock and you're staying as a flying flock, then comparing, what you're doing year on year, is the starting point. What has happened within the cattle system is that there is protocols that are just being developed in terms of being able to deal with flying herds. So what I would think is that as that it's just going through the sort of final stages at the moment, and I would think that we would probably be able to draw some comparisons with flying flocks as well, and there would be a similar type approach, so that we can make sure that not that's not always suggesting that everyone does is we just farm out the young stock to somebody else. We've got a sort of accounting process that goes through. But I would also say that in terms of showing progress within your business, just start benchmarking against yourself, pairing with others who might not be running a similar system, because you'll definitely come off better if you haven't got those young stock there.
and I suppose one of the key things which we keep going on about is the health elements, because if you buy in cheap and you bring in a lot of disease, then obviously your production efficiency drops and your carbon footprint
Absolutely.
increases. Yeah, so especially
Yeah,
things like
absolutely.
abortions, and also I suppose if you've got a flying flock in terms of the drenching regimes, is the quarantine drenching going on? Are we actually destroying quite a lot of those dung beetles in the land that they are being
Yeah,
farmed on? So those are the
yeah,
operational bits around it, I suppose, that can have quite a big impact on the financials, can they? And also the carbon element of that flock.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But I'm
yeah,
sure lots of people be
absolutely.
buying, if you are buying flying flock, you're probably buying from the same people. You've probably got a quarantine system to come in, so
Mhm.
it can mitigate quite a lot of those things. But ultimately, the land that's being used is the land, isn't it? Again, however it's being farmed, that's the resource that needs to be looked after, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
On a similar note, there's a question there in terms of red clover and fertility of sheep. I know there's been some work done with ADAS fairly recently, but what are your views, Becky, on red clover and sheep fertility specifically?
So again, I think it's we I suppose we champion the legumes in terms of the fact that they can improve protein content. They can obviously fix nitrogen and all those sorts of things. We need to, as I say, we need to understand the potential challenges in terms of in different systems. So we've got to be careful. We've got to know what we're doing and all those sorts of things. We certainly, as I say, within our network of farmers, we've got farms that are using red clover and are not seeing issues with it. That's not to say that that's the case everywhere, but certainly it's not something that I've come up across. But again, certainly do your research in terms.
Yeah, and certainly I think just to add to that, Becky, for Michael, I know that Mark Jones as ADAS, they did quite a lot of field sort of trial work. And what they were finding was that actually productivity or the lambing percentages and the condition of the ewes on red clover swards were vastly improved and actually outweighing any estrogen impacts, partly because of the new clovers in terms of what they do, but also in terms of the quality of the protein and the tannins and stuff in them. So all that ADAS work, which was done, I think must be about 3 years ago now, had a real positive impact using red clover for tupping ewes as opposed to any negativity. But as Becky says, there's probably a whole host of factors behind all of that. And don't take our word for it, make sure that you're checking it. But certainly
Absolutely.
the sort of quite strong evidence from that ADAS work was that there was no negative impact, which is quite important, I suppose. So
Yeah.
hopefully that answers that for you, Michael. We've got Ben's question. Do we still assume 8.9 tons per hectare of sequestration when direct drilling arable or paddock grazing grassland?
Sorry, I just missed the first bit of that.
So do you still assume 8.9 tons per hectare
Ah, okay. Sorry. Yes.
sequestration
Um,
when direct drilling arable or paddock grazing grassland? Yeah.
okay. So in terms of that 8.9 figure, if you have an improvement in terms of if you can improve your soil organic matter by 0.1%, then again, is an 8.9 tons per hectare improvement in terms of carbon sequestration. Now that's obviously based on obviously is change in organic matter over time, and we calculate the carbon stock at point one. So we need to know the soil organic matter or the soil organic carbon, the bulk density, and that allows us to calculate a carbon stock. Then again at point two, we'll do it again. And so I say a sort of broad rule of thumb is by 0.1%, it will sequester about 9 tons a hectare. So that again, that can be a sort of a useful starting point. And if we compare that of sequester on soil, the potential for soils and grassland, can massively outweigh. Having said that, so having your own measurement is a really good starting point. But obviously when we start these sorts of things, calculate what's happening in terms of emissions. Sequestration can be slightly more challenging because obviously we need to build up that level of data. So is where we've, I suppose, evolved from the early days where we were just saying, put in a 0.1% increase over 5 years and that will give you a start. It's just showing in that last example, is that we have a way of breaking it down by habitat. So to give you like a starting, you've got grassland, and there are a variety of different categories of grassland in terms of whether it's a low input permanent pasture, whether it's a and that will give you a starting point. Now that's not going to be as accurate as if you have your own test data, but in those of that body of evidence, it provides you a modeled starting point so that we're not in the position where we were before in terms of we were very good at. Having said that, we have farms, and a bit like that example that I just showed you, who are doing a vast amount more than 8 point. So it's about getting an understanding of where your soils are currently, where within that soil for you to change, and what the options are available for you to improve that, to make sure that we can take account of that.
Becky, we're losing the odd word. You're freezing up. So I don't know whether we stop your camera because it's a
Yeah.
shame to lose your words of wisdom.
Yeah, no worries. I'll turn it off and hopefully
Is
that will
that,
help.
and then hopefully we can hear every single word that you say, which is really valuable for us. So, great. Hopefully that gives you an answer. We've got another question similarly here in terms of you talked about peatland and moors and some of the upland stuff because we know there's some people on the call that are
Yeah.
farming, Scottish Highlands. How good are these prescriptions in terms of what we're using, Becky? Do they make sense? Do we know how to measure what sequestration is going on some of this higher peatland ground, or is there more work that needs to be done?
There absolutely is more work that needs to be done. If we think about peatlands are a really special case, in terms of the fact that, we have the peatland carbon code that allows us to sort of understand if we've got a condition of that peat to start off with, and that condition changes in terms of we improve it, then we've got a carbon value for that. But as I say, we've been doing some work in Cumbria, and also in Dartmoor, looking at currently how those habitats are classified. And then, as I say, actually going and taking samples, looking at peat depth, looking at, some of those acid grassland conditions, looking at some of those areas which potentially have been dominated by bracken or molinia or those sorts of things, and comparing them to some of those open areas. And what we find is that a lot of the published data that's out there, or the data that's used as a reference data, is often out by a factor of 10 in terms of the sequestration value. And what we found recently, is that actually, traditionally where we're being told that, those habitats where potentially you've got more bracken or you've got more of those sorts of things are better in terms of carbon sequestration. What we're finding when we're going out and doing some testing is we're finding that actually some of those grassland habitats where those animals are grazing are actually sequestering more carbon. So, this, which is a really positive message, but at the moment we need some more data. We need to be able, so we can talk about it on a site by site basis, but it really just shows that, where we've got these large swathes of land where, traditionally they've been grazed by sheep, and we're thinking about the ability for them to deliver multiple outputs, and often it becomes a very simplistic conversation about we need to take the sheep off because, it's much better if they're not there. What we're now starting to see is that actually the value of those animals grazing is really important, and so it really does highlight the need to make sure that we've got really good data, and we've got really good understanding of those carbon dynamics within, yes, those more organic or peatland soils, but in terms of what's happening.
And do you think our policymakers are listening or looking at all of that as well, Becky, or is that something that still needs quite a bit of dialogue to do?
I think certainly it's well, certainly, as I say, with the two little projects that we've been doing, we are, using that evidence and sort of trying to talk about it more widely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of policymakers, yeah, get fed up of listening to me because I do shout at them a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think all of this comes down to the more, I suppose, the more data and evidence we have, the better, and I think sometimes the narratives around, if we think about, why do policymakers focus a lot on, some of those solutions, which are things like trees or other bits and pieces? Well, they do that because, there's a lovely spreadsheet that tells them if you plant this many trees at this density, this is how much carbon it's going to sequester you. And, so our policymakers often like, simplistic solutions. And so we can say, well, if this is the size of the problem in terms of emissions, this is how many hectares we have to plant, and that's it sorted. And I suppose the challenge that we've had specifically when we think about being able to quantify it from a soil perspective is that soils are inherently more variable in terms of, we've got so much more variation in terms of the different types of soils, in terms of, grass is never just grass, what we're grazing it. So because there's all that variation, it's almost been sort of like completely ignored. And we've just gone, well, it's too difficult, so we'll just plant some trees, whereas in reality, as I say, there is untapped potential within our soils. And the benefit for us as farmers is that by improving our soil carbon, we're also improving our productivity. We're also improving, all of those other things as well. So it is a win-win, but we've got to be able to give them the evidence and show them where those things are happening. And so that's where, as I say, a lot of what we've been trying to do, in terms of with our soil carbon project, is start to say, well, these are some of the practices. So moving towards more rotational grazing, moving towards more diversity of species, all of these sorts of things are going to improve. And actually, sometimes we've been doing quite a lot of work recently looking at permanent pastures. And actually, rather than just saying we must protect all permanent pastures because they are delivering these multiple objectives, actually there's quite a lot of permanent pasture that could probably do with a little bit more intense management to actually make it deliver both in terms of forage quality and forage yield, but also deliver for carbon. So, maybe we need a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we're managing some of these systems to be able to make them deliver, for what we need them to do.
Well, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. We've got a question up there from Ben saying, how long do you think we can continue to put carbon into soil? And can we just continue to put it deeper in deeper?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's lots of discussions going on at the moment about the ability for our soils to continue to sequester carbon and all of those sorts of things. I think what we need to think about with this is that there are, I suppose, there's two main things to think about. Number one is around the ability for our soil, well, where that carbon is, I suppose. So we know that within soil there are two different fractions of carbon. So we have the mineral associated carbon fraction, which is where the carbon is bound to the clay particles. So again, that will then depend on your soil type and that carbon to clay ratio. So again, if you've got a more clay-based soil, you will have more sites for that carbon to be able to stick onto than if you're on a more sandy soil. And you'll see that reflected in terms of the percentage organic matter or percentage organic carbon that you can actually achieve. So that's one part. And traditionally, if we look at a lot of the research data around, saturation and all of those sorts of things, that is a lot of where that conversation comes from in terms of, there are only a specific number of clay sites and that's where they're bound onto. Now, what we've been doing for the last few years is looking at not just how much carbon, but where that carbon is in the soil profile. So that table I showed you earlier about that move to sort of more rotational grazing, what we tend to do is look at carbon at different depths. So we look at sort of 0 to 10 centimeters, 10 to 30 centimeters, 30 to 50 centimeters. And so what we tend to find is our soil, we can think about our soil a little bit like we think about our bank account. I'm sure we all love thinking about our bank account. What we've got is we've got that top couple of inches of our soil, which is like our current account. So there's loads of activity coming in, loads of activity going out. We've then got those lower depths of our soil, which is like our savings account. And what we want to be doing is we want to be translating or transferring some of that active cycling carbon down into that more long-term stable carbon. And so there probably is a limit in terms of how much carbon we can have within each of those depth fractions. And as we get nearer to that limit, the rate will slow down. But what we're finding is that again, we're doing a project at the moment looking at um, working with some organic dairy farmers, and a lot of those organic dairy farmers have got a high proportion of permanent pasture. And you would think, they've been organic, it's been permanent pasture. So the research would tell you that those fields are saturated, they're at their limit. But what we're finding is that they are still able to improve, but the improvements are often happening at those lower depths. So they're happening at that 10 to 30 centimeter depth. They're then happening at that 30 to 50 centimeter depth. And we know that the levels will be lower, but that carbon is more stable because it's less likely to be impacted by microbial activity. So that's pathway one. Pathway two is that we also know that there is carbon that is tied up within the biological community that lives within our soil. Okay, so again, and this is where the likes of the sort of the Christine Joneses of this world talk about the liquid carbon pathway. And so rather than just thinking about the ability of our soil to absorb carbon with the clay particles, it's also about thinking about the fact that that act of photosynthesis, obviously that's that liquid carbon pathway is going down through the roots, root exudates, all those sorts of things. Now, the bit that we don't quite know at the moment is how long term that carbon that's coming through that biological community is and how much of that gets translated. So there's lots that we don't know. And I think the people that say there is a limit, we'll hit it, therefore we can't do anything else, I think are being a little bit short-sighted. I think the people that are on the other side of that argument and says we can continue to sequester at huge rates forever are also a little bit. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But I think what that means for us in terms of as farmers is that, we need to protect the carbon that we've already got because we don't want to lose that. But at the same time, understanding where the opportunities are to fully utilize the whole depth of our soil, and also alongside that enhanced carbon sequestration, realize that by doing that, it builds resilience into our system. Because again, by allowing us to build that organic matter, it also means we hold on to more water, we can cycle more nutrients, we can support more biology. And that makes sense for us in terms of our above ground stock, as well as thinking about those below ground biological communities.
Absolutely. I've had a question emailed to me here saying how much change is required or is realistic to reach net zero by 2050? Now that's a question, isn't it?
That's a great question. Absolutely. And I think, my question, I suppose my response to that always comes down to it really depends in terms of what is included within the metrics. So if we currently look at reaching net zero when we are just looking at emissions, so we're not taking into account sequestration, and we are, using the sort of, currently accepted method in terms of the fact that methane is, 30 times more potent, yada, 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 then it's going to be super challenging to get there because we're not taking into account the positive. We're just looking at the emissions without taking into account the positive stuff that's going on. And so I am, we can get so far in terms of efficiency, but we are still going to be left with that residual level of emission. Because we know that in terms of as part of that food production, we produce emissions. Ruminants produce emissions because, carbon nitrogen cycles. So that is going to be really challenging. In terms of if we make sure that we can take account of what's happening in terms of sequestration, then actually I'm slightly more positive that, well, I am positive that we will get there. And actually, what I think is that at the moment, which for us as ruminants, where we're currently being, battered quite hard compared to some of those other sectors, what we find is that the ability to get to net zero almost becomes slightly easier for us as ruminants compared to those sort of, pig and poultry type sectors where they don't have those opportunities available to them because they are inherently linked to, high fossil fuel use with, with use of feed and all of those sorts of things. So I am positive, but it relies on the fact that that we need to make sure that sequestration is included within that. And it's not about saying that we can carry on business as usual and then just make it all rely on sequestration. We need to think about optimizing grass and efficiency. We need to think about all those other things, health parameters that we were talking about earlier. But I am positive that we will get there. I suppose the thing that we don't quite know at the moment is actually as that climate changes, the impact that that's going to have on existing production systems, and how we're going to deal with that. But I am optimistic. I think there's a lot of stuff. I think there is a good news story to tell within agriculture. We've just got to stand up and tell it about what we're doing. And I think sometimes we're a little bit worried about having that discussion because, we as especially as cattle and sheep, we've been smacked quite hard by this sort of stuff. And I think, it can mean that it can be slightly more daunting to have that conversation.
Yeah, no, that's really good to know. You put a slide up, Becky, about the US statistics, which was quite horrifying in terms of the calories coming from crops versus, the water usage and what was coming from animals and, hog farms and all the rest of it. How do we compare in the UK to that in terms of the population, in terms of our usage and stuff? Obviously, I'm assuming we're not using as much resource for animals here because we're using some of this marginal land.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things there. So we obviously, our and it's one of the things that I have a real bugbear with when they put up those global statistics, and they take things which have been in big systems. We do have a different system, and there is obviously when we think about sheep systems, there is a wide range in terms of that footprint depending on whether it's an upland system or a lowland system and all of those sorts of things. And we tend to compare quite favorably to some of those other countries. Also, if you think about it in terms of us as a nation, our footprints on terms of on a per person basis, we're also a lot lower than the US and some of those other places. So we do quite well, and I think that's sometimes the challenge when we get these sort of global figures in terms of like the sort of those seminal papers where it basically says beef bad, lamb bad, the other pork good, chicken good, and then querying and understanding what goes in behind those numbers is really important. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had at the moment. I think specifically as land use frameworks and use of land are really being discussed at the moment, and how do we use that land? How can we allow that land to deliver multiple outputs in terms of these sorts of things? There really is a good opportunity for us to talk about those those, the opportunity to utilize those grazing livestock to be able to show what's going on, because it is a point of difference rather than just lumping us all together.
And on the same vein, then, Becky, what's your view on carbon markets? Should they be allowed? Are they going to distort things?
So again, I think the carbon markets thing is really interesting, and I think what it's been really interesting to watch its evolution, I suppose, over the last 18 months. If you go back 18 months, I was probably being phoned up like, 3, 4 times a week from people being like, yeah, I've got loads of money, I want to do it, how do I do it, all this sort of stuff. That has sort of quietened down a little bit, as people realize that they might have lots of money in terms of they've raised money in London or whatever, but actually it's quite complicated in terms of, those sorts of things. I think what we're starting to see a lot more of now is the difference between offsetting and insetting. So if we think about how that carbon is sold, some of the early schemes very much were, companies that were potentially outside of our supply chains that
Mhm.
were using, then having that interaction with farmers through the voluntary carbon market, in terms of being able to offset some of their emissions. Now, the mechanisms in terms of how that works absolutely has been through, for arable farmers, predominantly through reducing cultivation and planting cover crops. And there's a model that says if you do those things, this is how much carbon, and they can provide certificates for that. I think what we're starting to see a little bit more now is we're starting to see the development of insetting schemes where, for example, if you supply into a supply chain, the supply chain might fund some of the things that you might want to do, and then everybody along that supply chain benefits. So, and I think that we may well see a lot more evolution with that, where, potentially there is a little bit more flexibility around how you can stack things on top of each other. So, you might be able to, deliver biodiversity and carbon and nutrients or whatever, and be able to bundle those things together. But also it means that, if you are doing a practice on the farm that is benefiting you as a business, that benefit is staying within that supply chain so that everybody along that supply chain can take account of that. Because don't forget, as I was saying earlier, in terms of that idea of scopes, you as a farm are your supply chain scope 3 emissions. So they are invested in terms of helping you to reduce that because they need to report on that. And so I think carbon markets will play a part. I think I quite often get questions from farmers that say, well, what do I do? Do I do something about it now? Do I need to get involved now? And I would always say no, because, they are a little bit like the Wild West at the moment. There is not a huge amount of regulation. The really important thing to think about now is, as I said earlier, to try and do a little bit of baselining so that you've got a starting point to be able to then, show progress on as we go forward. And what we know is that the size of the audience in terms of people who are having to access the voluntary carbon market and are having to do that offsetting is only going to increase as we get closer to the sort of, the 2030 check-ins and those sorts of things. We're only going to need to use more of that. So the price per ton of carbon is only going to go one way in terms of up. So, almost if you tie yourself in now, potentially you can't benefit from some of those increases later on. So at the moment, what I would say is, yeah, get some baselining, or you don't need to go and do every single field, but just strategically start picking off a few fields as you do your normal soil testing. So that gives you and because if you've got that measurement, it gives you the opportunity to take advantage of the sort of measurement based schemes which are going to attract a higher price as we go forward.
That's really useful. And the whole concept of insetting is brilliant. I think
Mm.
it's really innovative. So just last question, I'm conscious of time. It's a much lighter one, really. How do we improve the diversity of dung beetles on our farms?
Really good question. So obviously there are a variety of different species of dung beetles that are available. We've got obviously the ones that spend their whole life living in your dung, the ones that obviously tunnel down below, which are the ones that are really, really good, and then the ones that live within the tunnels. And again, we would like to see a mix of all of those sort of three key species, and there's different versions of those as we go through. Um, it really is to do with two main things, really. Firstly, to do with, I suppose, having having a regular supply of dung there, so having animals out grazing all the year, which, as I say, predominantly we do so that we've got that something for them to eat. Then thinking about obviously, worming strategies, thinking about what we're doing around all those sorts of things. So really, thinking about those, and then also thinking about the types of pasture that we've got as well. All of those three things will help to improve that diversity, but also, it's not it takes time. It takes time, and they'll go through that evolution in terms of you tend to start with the ones that live within the dung pats, and then they will, those other ones which can take a little bit longer. It's a little bit like, earthworms, the ones that are bigger, can take a little bit more time to come. But, again, get your spade out and look at your soil, but also, you will once you start looking for dung beetles, you will become one of those people that, gets thoroughly overexcited. My children won't go for a walk with me anymore because I'm always in and out of cow pats and sheep pats and all that sort of stuff looking for them. But, it really is an exciting thing to start looking for. And again, in terms of what I think with dung beetles is they are that incredible species that connects the below ground with the above ground in terms of biodiversity, and we only get them if we have grazing livestock. So, it is another really important species for us to be talking about around the value of ruminants, the value of grazing livestock, from biodiversity as well as from carbon.
Becky, that's a really positive note to finish on, I think. So, thank you all for giving us the questions. I think we've answered pretty much everything that's come on the Q&A and what's coming on emails. But as Becky says, if you've got questions, the recording is going out to you all, so you'll see Becky's email on it, and we will certainly be working closer with Becky because you really have infused us, without a doubt, into all of this. So it's very infectious, your passion for it all. So I think you're going to make us carbon saddles, as I said before, as well. And that statistics that we contribute to 12% of total UK emissions whilst feeding the nation. That's a big statistic, isn't it, that we have to work through. And you've got a plethora of stuff you brought forward there in terms of sequestration and how it all works. And I think you've given us a much, or certainly for me, you've given us a much better idea of how all of this works. And hopefully for those at home, you'll feel the same. So, Becky, thank you ever so much. And well done. You're doing a phenomenal job. And obviously, Farm Carbon Toolkit, farmer-derived, farmer-driven, really. So, yeah, it's a real credit and a great resource for us as an industry, I think, to work with you. So,
thank you very much.
And on that, I think we will call it a night. And thank you, Becky, again, and safe travels back tomorrow to the Southwest. And the next workshop we've got, or webinar, will be on the 18th of Feb. We're going a bit more back into genetics then, or actually the people behind them. We're going to be having the Hartley family from Pendle, breeding partners of Innovis, and also Sam Edwards, Sam and his wife Sam, and both of them very much, they won the New Entrants Farmers Guardian Awards this year, farming quite a lot of sheep these days without owning a single acre of land. So yeah, really good people to get to know and understand again. So please join us on the 18th of Feb, where we'll be back again for those, just to see some of the people that make all of this tick along. So, thank you, Becky. Thank you all. And we'll hopefully see you all soon again. Bye-bye.